welcome to the Royal College of Physicians, and thank you very much indeed for coming to this book launch of Victor Hoffbrand's book, co-authored with a couple of colleagues. And thank you to the college for looking after us and giving us this book launch. It's a fairly straightforward evening. We're going to have 3 talks. First of all, from Victor Hoffbrand, then Alan Humphries, and then myself, the author. But it's my pleasure now to ask Richard Thompson, past president of the college, if he'd just give us a brief welcome and introduction. Sir Richard.
Ex-President, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to introduce this book. When I was Treasurer, there are 2 things I'm proud of. One is I invited Henry Oakeley to become the Garden Fellow. Many of you know what happened at that. And secondly, Victor Hoffbrand came and asked if we would display his wonderful collection of pottery jars. Now, I know you have to be careful about Greeks carrying presents, but Victor wasn't Greek, so I thought this is an excellent idea, and we built at enormous expense that beautiful display cabinet down in the basement. I do hope we're going to see where these wonderful pots and Delftware are displayed. I should say a very warm welcome to Alan Humphries, who's come all the way from Leeds to give us his expertise. This is a wonderful book, beautifully printed by Oakley Books, beautifully printed and published by them, and I certainly recommend it. When I was at school, my botany master, this is a long time ago of course, said it's very important to know about botany if you're going into medicine. I found that wasn't true, but in fact he had a grain of truth in it. Because, of course, the college between the 16th century and early in the 19th century was responsible for looking at the apothecary shops, examining them around London, and responsible for throwing out things that were wrong. They had to have a deep knowledge, and they really did at the censors, their deep knowledge of plants that were in the apothecary shops. So now the college, and I realised this when Victor brought us his collection, has a complete collection of what the physician used to know about. We had a museum here many years ago, starting with Harvey, and that was burnt, and then a new museum which contained materia medica, which eventually given, sadly, in the 20th century to the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, and then also a series of anatomical things which were unfortunately given to the Royal College of Surgeons, where they were bombed by the Luftwaffe in 1942 and completely lost. But nevertheless, we do still have a museum, and the combination of the garden, which Henry is looking after, plants, and I've just come back from Padova, where they have a wonderful medicinal garden, not as good as this, but different. And secondly, the library, and of course we have a big selection of books connected with plants, herbariums, the pottery jars, and now also the pressed herbarium, which Henry, the Garden Fellow, obtained from Kew. And the Hortus siccus, it was called, the pressed herbarium, was again part since the 16th century, starting in fact in Italy, and then following in this country. Pressed plants were an important way for doctors to identify the plants and make sure they were prescribing the right plants. So the combination of those 4 now, the college now has, if you like, in its museum, a greater museum, the combination of 4 things that are important to a physician until relatively recently. So I'm greatly looking forward to the presentations, and I think we're starting with Victor.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the college. When I first suggested to the college that they should display the jars, I was told by the then librarian the college isn't a museum. In fact, it is officially a museum, and anybody can come in when they wish and come and see the jars of all the other things in the college. Fortunately, the second time I came, Richard Thompson was the treasurer at that time, subsequently president, and he welcomed the jars with open arms, and indeed they're beautifully displayed. I'm embarrassed to know how much the college spent on the shelves, but if people after the talks go down, they'll be able to see how well the jars look. I'm also grateful for the college putting on this evening, and to Mike Fear, who photographed all 206 jars and tiles and they're in the book, and they were freely given to us. The question I'm often asked is, how did I come to start collecting? And I think, like any chronic disease, it's got a genetic and an acquired elements. I think anybody who does collecting has got a gene for it, and some people have it and some people don't. Some people are even homozygous, they have it in very large amounts. I had small collections of things until this began. The acquired is that I went to a lecture over 40 years ago by John Wilkinson. John Wilkinson was a physician in Manchester who had collected these jars and gave a lecture on them at, of all places, Aviemore, where the British Society were meeting, and I listened to this lecture. I knew John very well because he was a physician with an interest in pernicious anemia and folic acid, which is crossed over with things I was interested in. At all events, I listened to the lecture, and then a few days later, Jill and I were at the Chelsea Antique Fair, and I saw a jar. If I could have my first slide, first picture. Yes. We saw this jar at the Chelsea Antique Fair, and I phoned John Wilkinson, and he said, yes, it's one of what I was talking about. You get it. So I got it, and then saw another one, and soon I'd built up to about 10. And then I realized I needed a dated one with its date on, because I'd realized by then that those were very special, because the dated jars helped to date all the non-dated jars. So I saw that this jar was for sale, so I went to the sale and bid for it. But some guy kept bidding against me, and in the end I dropped out. I really felt this guy would go on forever. So I thought, well, another bus will come along. But we went on holiday soon afterwards to Corfu, and as I came out of the swimming pool, who did I see the other side of the swimming pool but the guy who bought the jar? So I swam over to him and said, were you at a sale recently, and did you buy an apothecary jar? And he said yes. And I said, are you a private owner or a dealer? And he said he was a dealer. It turned out he was the arch dealer, the arch drug jar pusher. And I bought the jar from him, and subsequently a lot of the collection came through him. So that was my acquired cause of my chronic disease. Now, I do want to thank one or two other people. I want to thank Alistair Comston, who's here. This jar I gave to Nigel Comston, Alistair's father, when he retired at the Royal Free, because Nigel Comston was the senior physician there. When I went as a young professor, he actually helped me set up the haematology department. So when he retired, I gave him a jar. And 40-odd years later, Alistair has returned it to the collection. So I'm very grateful it's come back and is now one displayed downstairs. I also want to thank Jill, who decided not to treat my chronic disease, but watch and wait, which is a standard in chronic diseases, at least in hematology, of watching and waiting. And she watched and waited. She watched while I came in with a large raincoat with things inside it, and as the collection built up. But my main thanks are to my two co-authors. I should say the two authors, because they've really written the book. I've had much less to do with it, though more crossing I's and dotting T's and looking at serifs or whatever Alan had described on the jars. Henry is on the arts committee with me, and when we were talking about the jar, he suggested that we should do the book. He's a great enthusiast, but also he'd experience of doing books, other books, which he's done on orchids. And he's masterminded the publication from writing the whole of the section on the contents, the drugs, the pharmacopoeias, and contacting printers. The designer, Marcel Krull, is here. We're very grateful to him. He did a great job, we think, in designing it for us. Henry will be talking later. We couldn't do the book without Alan Humphreys. Alan is the librarian at the Thackeray Museum in Leeds. When John Wilkinson, who had the biggest collection of these jars in the world, who gave the original lecture and set me going, before he died, he gave his whole collection of 430 jars, 400, something like that, to the Thackeray Museum. And Alan has made it his life's work, or one of his life's work, is to catalogue all the jars that exist around the world. And there are about 2,500 of them. And he knew every jar before I got it, its provenance, and also could describe, when I bought very what appeared to be boring jars, Alan would say, oh no, but it's got an extra bobble here or an extra tassel there. And it's very interesting, or they couldn't fit the word into the cartouche. So Alan is the real authority on the jars, Henry the authority on the contents of the jars. So I'd ask Alan now to tell you about the jars.
Despite what Victor says, I still consider myself very much an amateur on these, but I do claim to have some expertise in. Sorry, is that better? Yep. Yeah, I'll try and shout a bit. I'm often told I've got too quiet a voice. As I was saying, despite what Victor says, I don't really consider myself an expert on these jars. I do like them very much, and I'm fascinated by them. But I've sort of accumulated a fair amount of knowledge over the years, I think. I've been interested in Victor's collection for about 16 years. I first encountered it as part of this project that I've been pursuing for about 20 years now, trying to track down and record every surviving English Delftware drug jar. This was inspired by the acquisition, as Victor says, in 1996, at first on loan and later by bequest, by the Thackeray Museum of Dr. John Wilkinson's collection, over 420 jars and nearly 200 continental jars as well. Part of my job at the time involved the checking off the jars against the doctor's typescript catalogue, adding the data to our collection database, and adding what further information I could. As I was doing this, I began to notice connections between jars in the collection, and also with others I'd come across in my reading about the jars in general. And I thought that if a corpus of jars could be put together, it might illuminate some of the problems I could see people were having with identifications and dating. The result is a listing, as of last week, of 2,437 jars and 178 pill tiles, as well as a few plates, jugs and other related material using the apothecary's arms or similar motifs. I was told about this collector in London who had over 100 jars, and on contacting him, I think it was through Jonathan Horn, he was most welcoming and gave me the opportunity to record and photograph the collection. I found it contained many nice examples of rare and interesting jars, as well as the usual common bird and basket and cherub and shell types. The first photograph I took was on the 17th of April 2000, and at the time the collection contained 125 jars. Over the years, Victor has several times said, "That's it, I've got enough." But then a few months later I get the phone call, "I've got another half dozen for you to record." So nearly 17 years later, the magnificent collection which you can see downstairs and which we've tried to record in our book comprises 202 jars and 4 pill tiles. For full details, see the book. Today I just want to talk about a few of the more interesting items in the collection. Number 1 in the book is this jar for Syrup of Comfrey. It is apparently unique, and its decoration is like no other English jar, though being similar to French and Italian jars. The shape, however, is very similar to jugs which were excavated at the Aldgate pottery site in the north of the Thames, and the glaze is also similar in colour, being a very pale brown colour, unlike the expected pure white of the earlier Delftware glazes. No decorated jug jars were found at the Aldgate site, but this example is possibly an earlier product of, say, Montague Close pottery, established in 1612, and thus probably the earliest known labelled English drug jar, perhaps 1630, 1640. Usually accepted earliest English drug jars design is the so-called pipe smoking man, noted dated between 1652 and 1665. This is followed by the angel type, known dated 1659 to 1722. The Hoffbrand Collection has one of the only two hybrid jars, with pipe smoking man cartouche and inscription surmounted by an angel. This example has a series of balls, presumably cloth balls or anyway, tassels, yes, that'll do. Hanging from the swags. There is one other very similar jar in a private collection in Scotland. This has the normal pipe smoking man cartouche with the mask underneath and the angel at the top with tassels above him. There is another example, a very similar jar, which is in the Colonial Williamsburg collection in America. They have quite a large collection of drug jars which they've acquired as an accessory to collecting all the different sorts of domestic Delftware that was produced at the same time. These are probably from the same pottery, again Montague Close, perhaps 1660, 1665 in date. There's a group of about 20 jars that as I've been looking through these jars, I've given them little nicknames, and I'm afraid this one I've called tricorn because it's got a little hairstyle that looks a bit like a tricorn hat. These are dated 1665 to 1675. 3 specimens in the Hoffbrand Collection, the nicest of which is this one here. Ointment for opening juices, I'm told by Henry. About 1670, probably made at one of the Southwark potteries at that time. There's 2 ornaments on it, which it's something I keep on making note of, but these ornaments that are used in the filling spaces or just to make it look more attractive perhaps, they're quite fascinating. I really want to do some more study on those. There are a large number of different styles in the painting of the angels, and one of my favourites is this jar for syrup of lemons with the initials BB, probably those of the apothecary Benjamin Burley, and the date 1671. I know 4 jars from this set altogether, and I've always been amused by the delightfully grumpy look on the angel's face on these jars. I wonder if it could represent the character of Burley. Be interesting to find out. One of the more interesting characters among the apothecaries was John Quincy, about 1650 to 1722, who was well known as a medical author, translating Sanctorius's aphorisms, publishing several editions of his complete English dispensatory, as well as a dictionary of medical terms. This small pill pot for amber pills, made in about 1690, probably belonged to John Quincy, IQ on the jar there. The coat of arms of the Society of Apothecaries, granted in 1617 when they received their charter from James I, has as its central feature the figure of Apollo holding a bow, you were probably well known. And this is one of the few motifs on the jars of which we know the origin. Most of them, why do they use an angel? The only time I've seen that angel regularly has been on gravestones. And you sort of advertising your product as being deadly, it's a good idea. But so why did they use the angel? But we know why they've used Apollo up on the top of the thing there. This is one of a large series of jars, probably 100 examples I've traced so far. The Hoffbrand Collection has 13 of those, which bear the head of Apollo flanked by 2 peacocks, as in this jar 1694 for conserve of Brum. Peacocks are a very common motif on Dutch Delftware jars, but only appear on this series and one other, which I'll come to later, in the English Delftware jars. One of the commonest motifs is that of songbirds and a basket. About 550 I've traced of those. There's a tiny group of jars, just 2 specimens, which appear to be a precursor of these. And they are in this one in this collection, which is you see here, and one in the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. They have a standard type of cartouche with 2 songbirds at the upper ends and a bunch of leaves and flowers in the middle. Henry could probably tell us what they were, but I don't know. The scallop shell, I'm going forward one. Birds are flanked by 2 tassels, sometimes described as carnation buds. And in the bottom of the cartouche is a miniature version of the birds and bunch of leaves. Finally, under the cartouche are 3 swags and 2 tassels. The jars bear the date 1672, and the initials GB, probably George Bearcroft. Again, details in the book. Another variation on the bird and basket theme is this group of 4 jars, 1 wet, 1 oil and 2 dry, which are unique to this collection. They are only known from Victor's collection. On this there is the rounded-ended cartouche with the drug names in it, basket of flowers and leaves in the centre above, supported by a stylised scallop shell, flanked by 2 songbirds facing left with their heads turned back. Unusual in that all other songbird jars, they face inwards. These face just one way. These jars came from a single source, and I just know no others of this type anywhere. This is a more standard bird and basket type, except in the swags under the cartouche there are 3 large white rings. It's part of a group of about 50 jars that I've found, the baskets normally have what looks like a sprig of parsley, and so I'm afraid these are called the Parsley Group. The jars are unusual, and some of them have the edges of the necks and the feet actually outlined in very pale blue. Just why? Nobody knows. Don't know. Let's sort this all out. It's obvious in some cases that errors were made when they were painting these jars. The sequence seems to be that the pot is thrown, is skip-fired, dipped in a white glaze, the basic design is painted on, followed by the inscription, presumably working from a list supplied by the apothecary, and the jar is then given a final firing. At the inscription painting stage, errors can occur. Victor mentioned that I was commenting about some of those. In this case here, the instead of nervin for an ointment for the nerves, you've got mervin, which is totally meaningless. We don't know. Other ones they start off quite well, spacing the letters, and then suddenly realise they've run out of space, so the inscription goes off in the end. As an aside, I wasn't going to say anything about this. There's a lovely one in the Wilkinson collection where it's exactly the same design, the bird and basket, and they were supposed to put O Olivar Opt, the best olive oil, and he starts O Oliver, oh dear, AR gets ligated together. There's a tiny little O just there, and PT is actually pushed into the end motif there. He was determined he was going to get that whole inscription on. Anyway, that's beside the point. Some of the ingredients which went into the preparation stored in the jars are quite exotic, and this is a good example. A small-sized jar for oil of vipers, one of the ingredients of theriacs and other universal antidotes. I only know 2 of these small-sized oil jars, both from the same set. This one, and one for oil of spike, which was in a Sotheby's sale in 1977, and I've no trace of it whatsoever since then, unfortunately. Another important piece of the apothecary's equipment is the pill tile or pill slab. These were used to roll out the pill mass, made of powdered ingredients bound into a paste with a little oil or syrup. This was rolled into a thin sausage, which was then divided into the required number of pieces with a knife or spatula, and finally rolled into the spherical pill shape. These come in rectangular, hexagonal, oval, shield and heart shapes. And I've traced just over 178 of them, I think it is. This particular type has often been attributed by earlier collectors and dealers to be Bristol or Liverpool manufacture. But in 1985, fragments of at least 6 of these tiles were excavated from the site of the Mortlake pottery in London. And you find an odd one, it might have been a sample taken, they'd say, make me another one of these. But you find samples of 6, some of them which show failures of firing in the kiln. They were obviously actually made at that site. So those were made at Mortlake, not at Liverpool or Bristol. The tiles, let's actually go back there. The tiles have a characteristic inscription, the usual one, Opifurque per orbem dicor, in purple, manganese purple, and they have a quite curious characteristic. How am I doing for time? The bottoms of the letters are often joined together on the inscription, and then you find groups of jars, same thing, manganese purple inscriptions, the bottoms of the letters joined together on there. And I'm pretty sure that these were actually made at Mortlake as well. Where have I got found? Sorry, ahead of myself. There's 279 of this style of inscription out of 920 jars of this basic type. And I think those were probably made at Mortlake as were the tiles. Probably 650 others that were made at Lambeth or some one of the other potteries. Other groups of jars, quite rare, seemingly rare, but they do turn up in quite large numbers, surprisingly enough. This one here is acanthus sleeves underneath the cartouche. There's 6 examples in Victor's collection, and I know of a total of 31 altogether. So they're not quite as rare as they might seem at first. Other jars are more truly rare. This one has got a sort of Medusa head underneath the cartouche. I only know of one other example, that's actually in the Wilkinson collection, a large show jar. This cartouche, this type also has a fairly square-ended cartouche, slightly curved. It's my suspicion this, and the one with the acanthus leaves and the wyvern type and a couple of others were actually made in Liverpool, but I'd love to find out. It's total suspicion. Towards the 1770s and 1780s, the Delftware industry declined sharply under the superior creamware and pearlware pottery that was being produced elsewhere. And there are several rare types which I interpret as an effort by the Delftware potters to modernise their wares and retain the custom of the apothecaries. One characteristic is the simplification of the decoration to a plain cartouche with an inscription in it. This one happens to be probably Mortlake again, that same inscription style. but I've never seen another Delftware pot with this shape. It's totally unique as far as I'm aware. Another attempt to modernise this jar, standard cherubim shell design, but it's actually creamware. It's made of creamware with presumably fired as creamware and then enamelled with the decoration on it. Other Delftware potteries were sticking to their standard traditional shapes, but they're getting desperate and simplify the inscription still further to just this basic, simple sweet almond oil. It's nothing very strange. I've never seen another one like that anywhere. The inscription like that. I mentioned peacocks before. This is the only other group of English jars that has a peacock on it as part of the standard description. It looks Dutch, but it isn't. There are, let's get this right, excuse me, 3 standard sized dry jars, 1 wet jar, 9 miniature jars, this being one of the 9 miniatures. Whether they were a Dutch potter who came over from and started working here, but it's a bit too crude even for that, I think. So probably an English painter imitating the Dutch wares for some reason. And finally, this jar, which is creamware again, a typical sort of shape you might expect for creamware. Little grooves around the foot, a strong neck there, but this strange plant tendrils above and below. Again, unique. Never seen another one of those. Anyway, that's me.
Alan, thank you very much. Can we have the first slide? Yep. My job was to talk about the inside of the jars, what was in it. But I thought I'd just show you a few slides of what it must have been like 500 years ago in an apothecary's workshop. And this is the alchemist's or apothecary's workshop in the Basel Pharmacy Museum, a recreation of what it was like. Coarse, primitive jars and alembics for distillation and things like that, weighing scales. And what you don't see there is the huge selection of herbs and animal parts which must have been part of the armamentarium of these people. And I've often wondered what these jars were for. I think they were for show. And I'm told by Alan that were for show. And if you look to the left here, we can see some apothecary jars of the blue and white type and some cream ones here. And they would have been, I think, on the back of the apothecary shop, like in the Basel Museum here, to show off to the customers what a good supply of stuff. Would that be right, Victor?
Yes, I think
Well, thank goodness for that.
in general the jars were so beautiful because the contents were so useful.
And that's why they had skulls and crossbones on them. Anyway, I was fascinated by these jars because there were all these wonderful jars, and I was told this was the biggest collection in private hands, and we were very lucky to have it, and we're clear we were. And there it was, all brilliantly lit. And I could understand nothing at all about it. And I felt that a collection, any collection without a catalogue, is about as much fun as a book without an index. How many of you ever bought a reference book with no index? Very rarely, but really it is the most depressing sight in the world. And this wonderful collection with no catalogue, and no librarian was going to catalogue it, nobody else was going to catalogue it. So I said we ought to have it catalogued. There was dead silence, so we got on and catalogued it. And first of all, we just did a transcription of the names, and then we went further, and Alan came in, and Victor came in, and we have the book. But you learn an awful lot about life in the 16th century and the 17th century from apothecary jars. You learn about politics, you learn about refugees, you learn about religious persecution, you learn about symbolism, you learn about all sorts of things. And the almost unshakable belief in medicines which went back to the beginning of time, which existed in the 16th century and the 17th century. And then gradually you see as the jars progress how these medicines changed. And the importance of the discovery of printing, which made people know what these medicines were and what they were for. Everybody who could read Latin, and then anyone who could read English, could see what they were supposed to do. And if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, they got stopped. Beforehand, it was all word of mouth, and you just accepted it, that somebody else had seen it, and therefore it was true. When you had a book, you could test it yourself. And so the pharmacopoeias go side and side with these things. And Alan said about these faces. Here is Benjamin Burley, the grumpy old fellow. And here is John Battersby. And here is Thomas Gardner, T.G., J.B., and so forth. And you can see John Battersby has got a little sort of thing, tie coming down here and a little white collar here, and so is Thomas Gardner. And I think they are. I mean, why would the artist paint anybody on the jar except the person who asked for it? Excuse me? Would anyone like to answer that? Alan? You're going to talk to me later. You can ask me later. Yeah. Anyway, so I agree with Alan. These are the apothecaries. And we just have a look at them close up. You know, they're all different. All right? And one in the middle, this one's got very funny teeth, or maybe it's a little tash here. This one's got a tash, and so's that one. You know, like the sort of Shakespearean tash or something smaller than that. But they're all rather fun, and they're all completely different. And you see several jars which have the same face on them. So I think this is the reason why I think they belong to the same apothecary. And here is a proper apothecary. This is Culpeper in an engraving. And you see he's got the same beard, a little tash, and the same collar, and a little thing hanging down. And here is Richard Tomlinson, who translated Renodius' Practice of Physic, with the same collar, the same hairstyle. These were apothecaries. They weren't angels, they were apothecaries. The fact they had wings on them, maybe because they were harbingers of the hereafter for the medicines they prescribed, but I have no idea. Am I convincing anybody? Doesn't matter, it's my story. And here are three ladies. Here are three ladies. This is a lady wearing a Dutch hat uniform, all right? And in 1700, there were Dutch lady apothecaries. And there was a lady called Susan Reeve Lyon, and I like to think this was Susan Reeve Lyon, whose distinction was that she was prosecuted by the college in 1632 for prescribing medicines for a physician without a permit from the college. And I'm sorry to say, the college no longer persecutes people who prescribe herbal medicines, but maybe time will come. Don't you agree? She's a girl. That's not a bloke, that's a girl. And there are two of them. And that's certainly a girl at the end, all right? And then we come, I'm supposed to be doing the inside, but I'm doing the outside. You don't mind, do you? Is that all right, Alan? You forgive me? Okay. Here is Apollo, the god of medicine, and the sun god in the middle, all right? And that's fine. God of medicine on a medicine jar, perfectly good. What are the peacocks doing? What connection possibly can peacocks have with medicine? Well, the French for peacock was Pion, and Pion was the Greek god of medicine from the Macedonian era. So maybe Mycenaean area, sorry. So maybe this was a pun for Pion, the Greek god, another older Greek god of medicine, represented there. But at 1650, at the time when all this was going on, a factory in Holland was established called the De Poor factory. And poor is Dutch for peacock. Can I convince anybody? It doesn't matter if it's not true, it's a good story. At least I hope it's a good story. And of course the phoenix, like the jars, from the ashes of these herbs, from these dead herbs, arose new life. I think that's pushing it a bit far. Anyway, there we are. So, peacocks. Now, the contents. You have to catalogue these plants, these jars. You have to know the contents. And you can't find the contents by just going on Google. You can try, it doesn't work. So in the course of doing Victor's book, I bought a few books. Victor may think he's got an addiction, hereditary addiction, but I know mine's hereditary. My uncle collected, and I've collected everything I've ever seen, right? And I would have collected cacti if somebody had given me one when I was 15, but I didn't, all right? But I've collected books and I've collected everything. So I collected this lot. But over 50 pharmacopoeias between 1470 and 1970. And the top shelf are all in Latin, and some of the second shelf are in Latin. And so this big book here is a 16th century Latin dictionary. It's no point having a modern Latin dictionary. It doesn't have the words which were used in the 16th century. And you need a dictionary to read the English as well, because it's quite different. So, great fun. And I have immense pleasure in collecting these books. And then the other thing you discover by looking at these medicines inside is the huge international trade which was going on in the world at that time in medicinal plants, and obviously in everything else as well. But just from Victor's jars, we can find plants which came from South Africa, Armenia, Saudi Arabia, Peru, India, the Jordan, Canada, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, the Moluccas, Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, Sumatra, Philippines, I've even spelt it right, China, Thailand, New Guinea, Chios and the Greek islands, the Moluccas, Eastern Ghats, Himalayas, South Asia, and Mexico to Brazil, and even China. All around the world, people were sending back medicinal plants. They were like the spice trade, they were hugely important. And if you look at a herbal person who supplied herbal medicines of the 1950s, you will find at the back of their catalogue 4 or 5 pages of international contacts, people who were still sending herbal compounds into England, but no longer. And compound balsamic syrup. Victor's only got a simple balsamic syrup, which only has a couple of things in it, but compound balsamic syrup came from Colombia, Arabia, South America, Saudi Arabia, Philippines, Sumatra, Mexico, Iran, and Chios. So these medicines could be extremely expensive, and you will notice that most of those are resins, because resins travel very well. And this is the syrup of balsamicus. And if I can just point out, the compound's very expensive, and it's good for various other things, but it cures gonorrhea and nervous diseases. Nothing else did, so maybe something expensive would. It stopped you getting old. And only the old have money enough to spend on nonsense medicines, don't they? The older you get, the more you spend on medicines. True? And in those days, if you wanted to stop getting old, nervous decay from age, you bought some of that, and it stopped you getting the French pox, rheumatism, scurvy, and all sorts of other things. And like Chinese medicine, it was today, traditional Chinese, it was used for everything. And here is another one, international ingredients with unusual use. And forget the unusual places they come from, we've discussed them before, but look at what Culpeper said it was for. Help those who think or see or hear strange things, especially when they are in bed, between sleeping and waking. And these are the people who have dreams or nightmares while they're awake. Like the cobbler in Silas Marner, who had narcolepsy. And he would have hypnopompic and hypnagogic hallucinations, and catalepsy, cataplexy, things like this. This is must be almost the first description of this condition, and here it is being described as a treatment from this compounds of this apothecary jar. So every time you look at these jars and you look at them closely, the more you look at things, the more fun they are. And this is a tiny little jar. Fun doesn't come in big jars, it comes in small jars. And Alan's already hinted about unusual ingredients. Oil of swallows. You took 16 swallows, whole and alive, boil them in chamomile, rue, and all that, and canary wine. And these poor swallows were used just to rub on your bruises. All right? Stick with arnica, please. Okay. Oil of earthworms. Earthworms look like nerves, and so they were used for nervous disorders, strengthen cold nerves. And you took half a pound of earthworms. This one actually says you wash them first, and then you boil them up in a bain-marie until the wine is evaporated. And then you get a sludge of dead earthworms. Isn't that fun? I hope you didn't actually have to take it by mouth, but there we are. You rubbed it on. And here's one with a great history of tradition, of association with a college. This is Lohock, which was a sort of thick linctus, of pulm, lung, V, vulpus, Lohock of foxlungs, linctus of foxlungs. It was very good for coughs and breathing problems. And foxes, of course, could run fast and were very good at running, and therefore they had good lungs, and therefore they must be good for the lungs. That's the doctrine of signatures for you. And, of course, they were wonderful. And Christopher Merritt, the inventor of sparkling wine, and the man who got sacked by the college for letting the library burn in the Great Fire of 1666, was incensed because apothecaries were using sheep's lungs for treating these conditions, and they couldn't possibly work. And, of course, he was quite right. And oil of vipers. 3 large, fat, live vipers. Chop them up, you boil them in the bain-marie and so forth, and we press the remains to extract the oil. And good for impetigo, gout, and leprosy. There are the vipers, there are things. And they also added St. John's wort, which, because it's a leaf which has pores in it, was good for the skin, and that's why it's in the mixture for treating impetigo. And of course, people argued whether Venetian vipers were better than English vipers, and so forth. All a load of rubbish. But they were powerful ingredients. But some of these medicines really go back to the beginning of time, and they really do show how long it took for medicine to change. And even in this era, we know of medicines and treatments which come in, like the treatment for gastric ulcers, where it was found to be due to a bacteria. But it took the gastroenterologists, how long, Richard, before they agreed with the Australians? Many years. But not quite as long as this lot, because this was a thing which was in use in the 17th century. It was attributed to Mesui the Younger, 1,000 years before. And it's just a simple mixture of olive oil, yellow wax, and rosin for treating ulcers. But if you look in Celsus, and this is a Latin translation of Celsus, and Cornelius Celsus, he produced a textbook. He produced lots of books, but only one survives, and that's his textbook of medicine from the 1st century AD. And it was the Bible. It was the Oxford book of medicine, textbook of medicine of our contemporaries at this time. And in it he says, this is the Latin translation from a Greek original, handed down as a written thing for over 1,000, nearly 1,700 years. And it says, oppum, annex, galbanum, pitch, resin, and olive oil. And that's what it was used back in 100 AD. And when you look at Quincy, and here's Quincy the Apothecary with his face up there, and this is his one of his posthumous editions of his book, still olive oil, yellow wax, resin, and pitch. Slightly simpler mixture, but still going on 1,700 years after Celsus. And then the more medicines, chemical plants you had in it, the more powerful it was. And even Pliny in the 1st century AD said this was rubbish. How could you possibly know the dose of each ingredient? And how could you balance them all up? And Heberden, you remember Heberden of Heberden's Nodes? He wrote for the college a little small little booklet which is in the library, which attacks the business of compound medicines. And these theriacs were enormous, and this one is the theriac of Andromache, the Venetian theriac, was attributed to the physician to Emperor Nero from the 1st century AD. And it contains 64 different ingredients. And it was a cure against all poisons. They've almost gone out of fashion, but if you look at the traditional herbal remedy licensing authority, there are now theriacs coming back in, and there are new herbal medicines which contain 20 different herbs. They're coming back. Some were for simple ingredients like squill, Drimia marittima, and some were for complicated mixtures like this purgative. And if we look at purgatives, and most plants have an ability to be purgative, make you vomit or have diarrhea. And if you look at the ingredients, senna, these are fairly tropical ingredients, some are English, senna pods, the seeds of the cucurbits, all good, powerful purgatives, and quite a complicated mixture for gout, agues, headaches, and the purgative. And some were much simpler. And if we look at unguentum of Aragon, an ointment, it comes from Spain probably, cold afflictions, you rubbed it on, Culpeper didn't think much of it, but that's just got simple English plants, sage, rosemary, marjoram, thyroux, cuckoo pint, cucumber, and things like that, which are available everywhere. So some of these medicines were easily available and quite inexpensive, and some were complicated and expensive because they came from overseas. And fortunately, about this time, medicines began to change. People read these books and they realized that some of these things weren't necessary. They listened to Heberden and they read their Pliny, and they realized that some weren't necessary. And this was a chest mixture. And this was the same chest mixture that my great-great-great-great-great stepmother was given as she was dying in Lambeth Palace in 1672. I happen to know this because I read the prescription. And it was written by an apothecary, so it was quite legible. Chest medicine, Surplus pectorals, contains zuzubes and cordials and raisins and dates and figs and a few English things or things. And then from 1564, they realized this wasn't necessary, and they found the medicines which really did treat coughs. And to this day, you can still get cough linctuses which contain opiates. And by 1694, opium poppy sap was the principal ingredient for Syrupus pectoralis, the chest medicine for coughs. And that works. So publication, the rose petals were just for fun, and the elderflower, we all have that, don't we, when, nice hot evening and we don't want to drink too much wine, yes? So it's just flavouring. And then became the beginning of the death knell for the apothecary jars, in my opinion, was the sudden realization that single medicines could be isolated from single plants. And William Withering and the foxglove, and discovering that giving dried foxglove leaf cured a lady was in a mixture, but it was the dried foxglove leaf in the mixture which cured a lady of heart failure, of dropsy. And he spent 12 years experimenting on his charity patients, while his private patients continued to get squill and other things, bloodletting and things like that, and found that very, very small doses of dried leaf of foxglove made people pee and got rid of their heart failure, their fluid retention from their heart failure. Before Withering, foxglove was regarded as far too poisonous a plant to be given to people. It was a violent purgative and emetic. And a colleague in another place, not medical, his mother was dying of heart failure in Eastern Europe, and he brought her to England to go around Harley Street, and they all said nothing could be done, nothing could be done. So he made her tea from foxglove leaves, just like William Withering would have done at the very beginning. And he gave it to her, and at the end of the afternoon, she no longer had heart failure, and they shipped the body back with a death certificate the next day. You cannot believe how powerful these medicines are in this. And digoxin, the chemical which comes from it, the doses to 125, 250 micrograms, which is about the weight of a third to a fifth of a grain of sugar. Very powerful medicines. And so the apothecary jars, for various reasons, began to disappear. These compound medicines were no longer looked for. People were looking for the chemicals, looking for the plants which were specific, they could use as medicines. The jars from the slipware jars came in, which were prettier and easier to do, and glass jars came in, and then everybody could have their medicine pre-packaged, bought across the counter, didn't have to be weighed out, all those things, and you had all the advertising, all the printing from the newspapers advertising things. This was the boom market, the bottle jars. and Delftware, for various reasons, disappeared. Leaving us with a modern pharmacy jar, the same creamware with a blue cartouche, made from a plant. So there's our college garden, our living herbal. That's the end. Now we have time for a couple of questions, and if any of you would like to ask a question, would you raise your hands and you will be brought a microphone to speak into. You can ask any of us. Well, that is fine. Can I now ask you if you would really like to go downstairs and have a look at the jars if you haven't already looked at them, and we will be selling copies of the book, and Victor, Alan and I will be signing them, and you'll be very, very welcome to join us down there. Thank you very much.